So I'm not sure if we've met before, but my name is Oye, and I'm the Democratic nominee for DC's U.S. representative. If I ever, statehood and making sure we finally cross that finish line, you know?
Yeah, we do. We do, of course. We have met. I'm from the state delegation office.
Yeah,
Of course, we did. We will make
absolutely.
sure that you win and join
Absolutely.
the delegation soon.
Definitely. I'm excited to be at this point, and
Absolutely.
we've never been this close to statehood,
I
so
know.
it's definitely the most exciting time to be here. Who would have thought? So you just need that last push of action across that finish line. All right. So thank you again for joining me. My name is Oye, and thank you all again for your support with friends, family, neighbors, DC voters. You guys were critical in me securing the Democratic nomination. I want to talk a little bit more about myself to begin. Again, my name is Oye. I'm a first generation Nigerian American that was born into a family living in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And my parents gave me one mission in life to have a positive impact on the community. Now, for me personally, they taught me that you won't be remembered by how much money you have or or the resource you're able to attain, but more you're going to be remembered by the impact you have on other people, how your community was better because of you, how you made a lasting effect on the next person. So when I graduated pharmacy school, moved to DC 6 years ago, I made my mission to just improve everything around me. So whether it's from volunteering in schools to become an ANC commissioner, I vowed to bring resources to the underserved. So for the past couple of years, I've been involved in a fight for DC statehood just to correct the injustice and make sure that DC residents have the same rights as everybody else in this country. So I thank you again for joining me for this Juneteenth special town hall. Juneteenth means a lot to me. Historically speaking, Juneteenth is an anniversary of the freeing of the remaining slaves in the South, which actually occurred 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So there were people still enslaved for 2 years after they were supposed to be freed. A lot of people recognize this as the true Independence Day of the United States. However, more than 150 years later, we still see examples of systemic racism. We still see examples of oppression. And I want to talk about some instances of that and how we can find meaningful policies to correct these wrongs. So thank you again for being here. I want to go through them one at a time. The first one I want to talk about is police reform. This is a hot button topic, especially after the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, the killings of George Lucas, most recently Rashard Brooks, where we saw unarmed black men being killed. I believe that we have to go back to the root of our modern day police and how it was created and how we should reimagine their role in our society. So, basically speaking, the police were constructed in the 1600s and 1700s to catch runaway slaves. So they were going to people's houses trying to find escaped slaves, and they were basically used to capture people. In 2020, we still have that mindset of catching bad guys. Even though slavery has been by and large abolished, we still see law enforcement as catching the bad guys. I believe that it'll be better seen as improving the community. And that way we can judge them in a better way. And that way they won't be so pressed and they won't be scored on how many bad guys they catch. So one thing I really want to focus on is how folks are talking about defunding police. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some people believe that defunding police means we'll just abolish them altogether. Some people believe that we'll just reduce their budget until they're not functional anymore. But most of the literature I see about defunding police is to combat these spending increases in our police departments all across the country. Also, in this current day when there's a lot of protesting, we're trying to increase the amount of accountability that we see in our law enforcement. So right now, I personally am in favor of defunding police in a way of not increasing the budget for them. However, use that money responsibly to improve our communities. Like I mentioned before, I believe police officers should be seen as improving the health of a community and less as in catching the bad guys. So, give me one second. So something else I wanted to talk about is how we need more accountability with law enforcement in Washington, D.C. This includes increasing penalties civilly as well as criminally. Right now, when it comes to civilly, people are unable to sue law enforcement because they have qualified immunity. What that means is regardless of the infraction or regardless of what a citizen experienced with an officer, the courts are not able to hold them accountable civilly. There's legislation on the floor of Congress to allow police officers to be sued individually for things that occur between them and the community. I just want to say that in terms of accountability, we need to allow the citizens who feel wronged by the police to take their matters civilly. That way, people can actually have more oversight over police and law enforcement, as well as trying to make sure there's justice all around the board. We also need to create more civic oversight, meaning that we need boards of people, whether it's residents, whether it's local leaders, whether it's activists in the community, to have a say on police policy as well as investigations. In terms of criminally, I do believe that it is very difficult to be a police officer, and there are structures in the system that makes it very hard for the police to police themselves. So when something were to occur, that'd be an adverse reaction, a lot of officers have a very difficult time in pursuing corrective measures within the department. I personally believe that the best corrections will be made outside independently of police officers. And I do believe that civic boards and civic programs to have us oversee instances of wrongdoing will not only increase transparency, but lead to much better results within the community. I'm also asking for all body cameras to be on at all times and for body cameras to be mandatory. And if it's not followed, I believe termination should be recommended. This is because that as taxpayers, we pay for these cameras. We pay for these functions to be on so there'll be more transparency. And if there's law enforcement out there that isn't abiding by that, and there's a situation that comes up, I'm fearful that we won't have trust in the system, and at the end of the day, we won't be able to know the truth of what happened. A lot of body cameras not only exonerate people, they not only exonerate people who feel like they've been wronged or they've been stopped for a wrong reason. Many times, they actually help officers when they're accused of doing something that they may not have done. So I find it critical for body cameras to be on at all times because not only does it aid in investigations, it also increases trust in the system and trust within the community. Most recently, there was a hearing in which the mayor proposed having a $19 million increase in the budget for MPD. Chief Newsom also talked about how it's important to increase the officers in duty. They've been having a hard time recruiting officers from DC. A lot of activists have actually come out against increasing the funding and the amount of police in our neighborhoods. I personally feel that it's critical that we look into ways to use that extra money, that $19 million, and put it in programs that focus on the development of the community. Not just trying to catch the bad guys, but improve the community in which we may have people not seeing or not experiencing the levels of trauma that we're seeing nowadays. I believe that money should be invested in athletic programs. opportunities for young people to use that energy more productively. Whether it's sports programs, whether it's cheerleading, just ways for young people to have something to do. I don't mind create evil intentions. And I really believe that if we put young people in the forefront of these activities, they'll use that energy, meet different people, gain leadership qualities, something that could actually impact their lives productively. I also feel like officers should actually be involved in these athletic programs, whether it's being a referee in a basketball game or being a commissioner in a local event. That way we see officers in non-emergency situations. And also we see them in positive situations. So young people can actually see an officer as a role model, as a human being, and less as someone who's getting me in trouble. When I volunteer in elementary schools, I meet 4 or 5-year-olds that grow up, that say they want to grow up and be an officer. By the time they turn 13 and 14, they don't say they want to be officers anymore. We got to keep that 10-year window with positive experiences so we don't have to put so much resources into recruiting kids from the neighborhood. They already want to be that. I honestly believe this is a win-win situation, that the people in the community feel respected and they enjoy their time with officers, and officers feel more respected and safe in these neighborhoods. A lot of these officers don't live in the neighborhoods they patrol. So we have to put them in there physically so they can be able to see the fellow person as just a person and not someone to go after. I also believe that $19 million could be better spent on STEM programs, on education opportunities. That way we can get young people and not only engage them, their bodies, but also their minds is something that can impact their futures. There's such a tech shortage in this country, and coding is the future. If we can get young people in the inner city, or even all over the world, all over the country, to really focus on coding, we can find the next Bill Gates. We can find the next Steve Jobs. We can find the next tech executive in our inner city. That will change the dynamics of the community. That will change the dynamics of a family. Now you have a parent who's taken care of by the children. You have younger siblings who have older siblings who they see as a role model. Now you have people in the community that's going to be around the circle of success that can inspire somebody else to get into it. People can actually hire folks that look like them. That often happens in other ethnic groups, but if it could happen here in the African American community, then that just increases our own wealth. I truly believe in reinvesting into the people. That way we can develop safer neighborhoods rather than putting the pressure on officers to keep finding bad guys that we can otherwise have more productive options and opportunities. I also believe we ask officers to do entirely too much. When it comes to civic programs, we have firefighters and we have officers. Firefighters go into burning houses, they go into forests, and they treat fires. We have a high opinion of firefighters because they are trained to do what they do, and they do it admirably and well. With officers, I'm afraid that we ask them to do way too much. We call them for domestic violence situations. We call them for violence situations. We call them for parking enforcement. We call them for drug overdoses. We call them for many things that they may not be fully experts in. Now, there's certain situations where an officer is needed. And there's other situations where an officer may need additional professionals, if not fully replaced. I want to cite the Cahoots program that's in Eugene, Oregon, that places licensed professionals in more targeted interventions where an officer may not be needed. For example, a drug overdose. They will send another professional out there and it will treat it as a healthcare crisis rather than a police intervention. So the way that program works is that someone will call 911 for a situation, and the dispatcher would, through training, figure out who would be the best to be called. So in this situation, about 20% of all 911 calls gets diverted to the Cahoots program. And what the Cahoots program is a coalition of experts who are able to better defuse the situation, or who may just be able to provide a better service at a better, higher value than an officer would. In this program, in 1 year, this $2.1 million intervention saved the state of Oregon $15 million. And this is because they were able to diffuse the situation, not trigger people by their police presence, and be able to streamline that program, that person to a better program and lead to better results. When you call an officer, oftentimes someone is arrested. However, in these situations, the CAHOOTS program led people to mental facilities, they led people to domestic violence shelters, and just other outcomes that are more beneficial to the nation. I personally believe that our police department needs to be reimagined. I don't believe that this is a zero-sum game. I do personally believe that once we change the way we see our policing, it'll be much easier for officers to patrol our areas and keep us safe. And it'll also be easier for the community to feel respected and also feel safe when they're around the police as well. The next thing I want to talk about when it comes to policing is their interaction with young people, especially in the inner city. We have many archaic policies like stop and frisk, which overwhelmingly impact young kids of color. I'm talking about Black men. We are disproportionately targeted when it comes to stop and frisk, and we don't commit crime at a higher rates than our other counterparts. This also is an inner city problem in which people of color in the inner city are over-policed and have much unaddressed trauma compared to their counterparts in the suburbs. I believe we need to reverse this and actually have positive experiences with everybody and not just go after tried and true methods that don't work. I'm against stop and frisk, and I'm against the over-policing in our inner cities. I truly believe that at the end of the day, we need to find a system that we pay for that's accountable to us and not necessarily to a system that wants to arrest us and treat us unfairly. I also believe that police officers need to re-examine the way they interact with young people in schools. Right now, we invest much more money in officers in schools than we do with social workers. In DC, we have about one social worker to at least 220 students, when the guidelines suggest we should have one social worker to 50 students. Some of that $19 million should go into social programs and wraparound services, not only for the students, but also for their families as well. This is critical for the development of young people, as well as their families, as well as our communities. I believe we put too much stringent on law enforcement in our schools that help create a school to prison pipeline, whereas we should put resources in the communities to help improve our communities altogether. The next aspect of my town hall today is public service and mental health. So for me personally, I believe that when it comes to policing and when it comes to mental health, we have to address our current healthcare situation altogether. Nothing has exposed us more than COVID-19. We have so many people that are not getting tested, and that's affected how we get back into this country, how we reintegrate ourselves back into normalcy. So we have people dying, we have people who aren't even getting tested, we have people who we don't know if they have it or not. So we're really saving our resources for the people who experience symptoms. And by that time, we're so far down that road, we're losing people, having worse outcomes and increased costs. So we are understanding how important it is to really get in front of physical health, but we are really neglecting our mental health capacity. If you can just imagine how many people aren't getting tested for COVID, imagine how many people aren't getting screened for mental health issues. Most people I know have never gotten a mental health screening. And what's happening is we're reserving all of our resources that we have for people who have already experienced symptoms. Or if worse, we're blaming bad situations in which people harm themselves or harm their communities and retroactively look at it and say, these are issues that were caused by mental health. As a healthcare provider, I understand that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We need to do more to invest in mental health. Currently, our America's largest mental health facility is in Chicago. And that mental health facility is Cook County Jail. Over 2,700 prisoners have been diagnosed with mental health issues in that prison only because every single person who walks into that door is screened for mental health issues. These are folks who don't have as much care outside in the real world, who are self-medicating with drugs, who are causing harm to oneself and one's community, and only has these issues addressed once they're in jail. However, once they leave jail, they enter a system where they're not getting that care again. Oftentimes, this leads to recidivism, people going back to jail. So we're wasting money on imprisoning people who would otherwise have better outcomes if we treated them already. However, we shouldn't just stop at prisoners. This is a highly stressed country in which people are very stressed out. There's a lot of depression, and we are not doing enough to screen folks. Furthermore, we have an access issue. There are not enough mental health providers in this country. We need to fix that. We need to make it more desirable for people to get into the mental health industry. Lastly, the costs are enormous. Right now, our insurance system, they prioritize physical health and they don't prioritize mental health. A lot of time, they exclude people who have experiences of mental health from future care. We need to change that system altogether. We need to treat mental health in the same capacity we treat physical health. That way, we will increase outcomes, we will increase access, and we will reduce stigma. If we allow every single person in this country to receive a mental health examination, then there will be less stigma of people who get further treatment. I believe this is critical. I believe this will help improve our communities. I believe our community leaders have often addressed mental health issues as a cause of our destruction in our communities, and this needs to be handled now. We need our actions, we need our legislation to match our words. Right now is a little bit of lip service. I want to end that lip service and really create positive legislation for folks to feel that their mental health is being prioritized. We have far too many young people taking their lives. We have far too many mass shootings that people are attributing to mental health. We have far many opportunities and we have no time to waste when it comes to mental health and addressing these issues. I have put forth a resolution that would actually mandate insurances to cover 2 mental health screenings and evaluations per year for each American citizen. At this point, the resolution applies to DC residents, but I know this will be beneficial for not only the people, not only the families, but our community at large. And I hope DC, once they implement this, will be a guiding force for the rest of this country. That way we can really put forth the energy to make sure that we are addressing our mental health. Lastly, I want to speak about DC statehood. So as your next shadow representative, I'm going to be working all day to make sure we become the 51st state. Right now, in the most developed country in the history of the world, the residents of the capital do not have the same rights as everyone else in this country. We are living under second-class citizenship. We don't control our budget. We don't control our National Guard. We don't have final say over our laws. We basically don't have self-governance. With the work of Eleanor Holmes Norton and all of our district leaders, as well as Paul Strauss, Students for Statehood, DC Vote, organizations that really put in the groundwork, we are finally as close as we ever been to becoming a state. We have a historic vote coming up on the 26th, where DC Statehood will come to the floor of the House of Representatives. And we have enough co-sponsors to actually pass the bill this time. This is important. This is amazing. This has actually become a big story across the country. The president's also chimed in on it, so it's on his radar as well. Although I'm disappointed in the response from the White House, as well as Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Senate, I do believe that this is time for us to really control this conversation. DC statehood has been called full-blown socialism. However, the fight for DC statehood is rooted in the Constitution. I believe it to be fully democracy. And hopefully with more engagement, more conversation, this will also be able to become bipartisan. Now, when it comes to people outside of Washington, D.C., it's also critical to get involved with the fight for DC statehood. Not only because it's the right thing to do, and we all know that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, but it also is going to help us shape the country where we want it to be. In order to pass essential policies like Medicare for all, a more just tax system, income inequality, we need the right leaders to be at the table. DC statehood would accomplish 2 more senators who think progressively, 1 more representative, myself, who believes in essential ideas, and will help shape this country of how we want it to be. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very excited. I'm glad to be the DC's next U.S. representative. I can't wait to join the fight. But at the same time, I already feel like I'm a part of the fight because we all have something in this and we all want to see a better United States. We also want to see DC become a full fabric of the United States. I thank you for your time, and I'm opening this up for questions if there are any. Let me unmute the lines. So give me 1 second. So you all can unmute your lines if you like.
I think you're muted.
Thank you for that. So that was a very great question about how we should pursue democracy in Congress. The first things foremost, we have to make sure everybody has a voice. We have to make sure that we allow the majority of the Americans to make the best decision for what we want this country to be. I believe the best opportunity to do that would be ending the filibuster, allowing the majority of the Congress to make the best decisions. In the past, every state that had to be admitted to the Union just needed a majority vote as well as a presidential signature. I believe that's still the same case, and I believe we need to reduce and eliminate the barriers to making that happen. I personally believe that we also need to fully energize all of the Americans as well as the representatives, because this is not just a voice for DC. This is also a voice for America and where we want our country to go into, how we want our country to only reflect the best of us. We want our culture and our government, and our legislature to match the speed of our culture. Oftentimes, when you look into Congress, they don't represent the demographics, the backgrounds, the race, the age of a lot of our thinking, or a lot of our demographics, or a lot of our constituencies. We need a little bit better representation in terms of that. And hopefully that's what I believe what democracy means to me. And I also believe that that will shape our country into being better as best as it could be. I don't believe in the Make America Great. I just believe in making America better. And I believe this helps us make it better. Another question, what methods for law enforcement oversight would I adopt into policy? So, like I mentioned before, I would want to do away with the qualified immunity. That way, people can actually sue officers directly who are involved in what they find not so good behavior. I also believe that officers should consider getting insurance, liability insurance. As a pharmacist, I have to get liability insurance. If I were to ever be sued, I can't ask the American taxpayer to bail me out. I don't believe it's fair for the American taxpayer to bail out the 15% officers that are causing 85% of the problems or 85% of the complaints. I believe they should be responsible for their own and should be able to have their own insurance, and which would mitigate some of the costs that we see that way. I also believe that we need a full board of civic engagement, not only when things go bad, but also to be able to quality assurance, be able to improve law enforcement on a daily basis. We need members from the church community. We need members from Black Lives Matter. We need members of the LGBTQ community to be at the table of law enforcement so we can actually be able to tell people how we want to be policed. This should not be a top-down measure. This should go both ways. They should be able to get impact advice from us. That way they can be better able to serve us. What do I think about the Supreme Court upholding DACA? I am fully supportive of that. I appreciate that. I have a cousin who is a DACA student. He's affected by DACA directly, and it means a lot to me. I also believe we need to speed up the immigration process. We need to make sure that people who are here have a right to stay here, and people who contribute to this country productively have a fast pathway to citizenship. Had Donald Trump been president 30 years ago when my parents were in college, I might not be here today. So I need to make sure that I protect first generation Americans as well as immigrants to make sure they feel valued and they have a pathway to citizenship. And me being a first generation American, I think it is important for me to talk about how I feel personally connected to this fight. Although I was born here in the States, I do feel like we as first generation Americans, we provide the fabric of this country. We do a lot to improve this country. A lot of undocumented immigrants pay taxes. They pay into Social Security, even though they won't be eligible to receive it once they turn the recommended age. So we have to understand the actual value that people who weren't born here bring to this country, and not put ourselves into silos and say that America first, America only. I honestly believe that it's important for us to value every single person, regardless of where they're from, who they marry, what their age is, and be able to empower them. That way, our country will be reflective of the people who live here and the values that we want to uphold. So when I see a question about mental health screenings, do I support expanding them to schools? Absolutely. Absolutely. The childhood is the most fundamental time in somebody's life. And even from my own past experiences, if I were to have mental health screenings earlier, I may have made better decisions. A lot of kids who make bad decisions, like fighting in school, like joining the wrong crowd, or doing illicit behavior, a lot of this comes from past trauma. I did a sex trafficking resolution that addressed young girls getting into the criminal justice system. And 1 out of 4 of them experienced childhood sex trauma. These are things that need to be addressed. That way someone can live the most productive lives that they can and positively impact the community. Mental health screening is an investment in our people. It's an investment in our community. It's an investment in our future. And starting as young as possible is critical. I also believe that these have to be as confidential as possible. It is important for children and young people to know that they're in a safe place when they speak to a qualified professional. They must know that their information that they're providing is confidential, that won't be shared with teachers, parents, or other people unless it's absolutely necessary to. And I believe this is important because when somebody feels that they're in a safe place, they can share more. That way we can give them the right treatment they need and the proper care. What challenges of DC statehood passing do I expect to run into? I think the biggest challenges is partisanship and just getting the word out. It is critical to make DC statehood a non-localized issue. This is for what kind of country we want to live in. This is for the society we want to grow up in. This is for making sure our children grow up in a more fair America than we have today. I do understand that right now there are some partisan issues in which the right side of the aisle may not want to see two more Democratic senators. However, in my past experience in lobbying, we have found out there is some opportunities for bipartisanship. There are some other areas, whether it be Puerto Rico, or other areas like Guam or so, that will possibly be united into the United States as a state alongside DC. While I'm not opposed to coupling myself with another area, I do feel like it's important for DC to be focused on our statehood. We've been fighting for this for 50, 60 years, and it's critical that we drive our statehood home. I do believe that we need the votes in Congress to get the other side to chime in on their perspective. But with that said, it is critical for DC statehood to be achieved by any means necessary. So while I am focused on increasing democracy everywhere, I am also representing the constituents of Washington, D.C., and I'm also trying to bring our fight to the finish line. Are there any other questions? So next question is, how do I feel about working with council? In Washington, D.C., our city council is paramount. They are critical in passing legislation. Thankfully, as my experience as an ANC commissioner, I've had very close communications with majority of the council members, whether it's our healthcare situations, whether it's with how we police. They have been very critical in how we shape legislation and our livelihoods in DC. I've already experienced communication with council members. I have experience with dialogue with them as well. They are very receptive to the advice I give. And as an advisory neighborhood commissioner, I'm very thankful for that experience because it's prepared me well to work with them come become a U.S. representative, as well as the mayor's office as well. I believe we all have the same mission in mind, improving the life for DC residents. I also want to lobby for district rights with federal policy measures by working with the people who already put in the hard work. The young advocacy groups, DC for Statehood, 51 for 51, DC Vote. These are organizations that have done the groundwork to get us where we're at today. Although we see the politicians on the press conferences, and they've done the great work as well, credit to Senator Paul Strauss, credit to Delegate Eleanor Holmes-Norton, credit to current Representative Frank Garcia. We also have to acknowledge everybody else on the ground level who's spent hours in Congress people's offices. You know, people who really spent time educating DC residents about not only why DC statehood is important, but what DC statehood will mean, how it will impact people's lives. I think with COVID-19, it was very critical because it allowed us to see how statehood affects every single piece and aspect of life in the district. So folks who cared about how we spent money in healthcare, folks who cared about how we spent our money in our schools, people who care about who has final say over our budget, that's all DC statehood related issues. Once DC becomes a state, we have control over that. And people are starting to realize that. When the CARES Act gave us 60% less resources than our neighbors in Maryland and our neighbors in Virginia, that made a difference because people from Maryland, Virginia come into DC all the time. So what ends up happening is that what affects them will affect us, and what affects us will affect them. Had we had the full amount of resources, we may have been able to open our shops earlier. We've been able to go back to school faster. We've been able to protect ourselves better. We've been able to get better testing, even start providing antibodies. These are all issues that are affected by DC statehood. What are my thoughts about Mitch McConnell? Obviously, we have policy differences. We come from different perspectives. But I'm willing to work with him as a congressional member because that's what I'm going to be elected to do. I feel like it's paramount to work with those who may have different ideologies, but able to find common ground. I believe Mitch McConnell believes in democracy. I believe he believes in people having rights. I believe he believes in states' rights. I believe he believes in doing what's fair. And I believe that I can convince him to prove that by supporting DC democracy, supporting DC statehood, making sure that 700,000 DC residents are not subjected into second-class citizenship in the capital of the richest country in the history of the world. I'm prepared to talk to him. I'm prepared to discuss DC statehood. I'm prepared to fight for the rights for DC residents. I also feel that, give me 1 second. I have another follow-up question. The right to self-determination is not full-bore socialism. So that's just a continuation of a comment that Mitch McConnell stated. I believe that he wouldn't want his residents in Kentucky to be subjected to second-class citizenship like DC residents are. In fact, given that we are a donor state in which we pay more to the government than we get back, couple that with Kentucky receiving more federal resources than they give to the government, I believe it's more socialist that we're paying them to survive and live and be able to pay for their federal programs than us having a right to have a say where our money goes. Our money is going to programs that aren't so popular, like wars. DC residents paid billions of dollars for the war in Iraq. We're paying for Trump's policy on the border. We're paying for the salaries of Supreme Court justices. We need to sit at the table so we can have our say on where our money should go. Just like Maryland does, just like Virginia does, just like Kentucky does. We need to be able to say, hey, these are our policies we want. We want a more fair country. We want a healthcare system that treats everyone with dignity. We want a better immigration program, immigration system that values the lives of people that are born in this country and people that were not born in this country. We want a system in which there's money in politics, but not to the point that our politicians are serving the donors and not the way of the people. We want to continue our own policies and our own values and spread that to the rest of our country because we have a say in this too. What do I like to see come out of the Black Lives Matter movement? I really want the Black Lives Matter to be a part of our decision making and not just forced to be a protest movement. Like I mentioned earlier with the police, I think it's critical for people from the activist community to have a say on how we're policed and not just show up on the street when things go wrong. And I think it's important for our lawmakers to include them in our discussions so that way we have a right to say how we like to be policed. We want to say how our law enforcement should serve us, what role they have. We have a lot of people from the activist community that say we need more social work in 911 distress conversations, not just people with guns. Guns are very triggering to people. Guns bring violence into a situation. We have a lot of officers who say they're uncomfortable in certain situations, they're afraid for their lives, so they discharge the weapon. What I'm saying is that if we invite other members of not just law enforcement, but other members who are equipped for certain situations, they may be able to de-escalate a situation without use of a weapon and will lead to a better outcome. When a police officer shows up, a lot of people are getting arrested. Sorry, give me 1 second. People are trying to join the call. Okay, so people get arrested. We may need to find a situation in which these calls are being made and the outcome isn't an arrest. The outcome is a diversion program. The outcome is someone possibly going to end up in a domestic violence shelter. A lot of women who are calling the police for domestic violence end up striking back at their attacker and they get arrested. Now they're entered the law enforcement criminal justice system, which they were trying to help protect them, but now they're put into a system in which will yield negative outcomes. At the end of the day, all my ideas are geared towards positive outcomes and not geared towards arresting and catching bad guys. I feel like we need to re-envision how we see policing in the inner city as well as the rest of America. That way, they'll be part of an ongoing solution and not seen as a problem. I don't want to call police officers the problem. They're not the problem. However, there's a system at place that puts us versus them. We should have the same goal and work together to achieve that goal. And I believe the Black Lives Matter program and the Black Lives Matter movement is critical in ensuring that we have a police and law enforcement that serves us, the people. Lastly, as we conclude this town hall meeting, I want to thank you again for joining me. Your support has been critical. Your attention, your words of encouragement, your support, your vote has been critical for me to be here. But more importantly, your voice is critical to getting us DC statehood. Because like I said, that is critical in shaping the America that we all want it to be. I believe we all have a purpose here, whether it's electing officers, whether it's telling your friends about DC statehood, whether it's calling your own representative saying, I need you to support DC statehood. It is important to have your voice in this conversation. This is not a 700-person problem. This is a national issue. This is a U.S. issue. This is a 320 million person issue because this shapes how our immigration is going to be. This shapes how our law enforcement is going to be. This shapes how our tax system will be. This shapes how our politics will be. And your voice is critical. And I thank you so much for joining me for this town hall today. Thank you.